We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's June 26th here in Seoul. I'm Shin-Yun, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Kim Xiang.
Good morning, yeah.
And Jessica Dainong.
Happy Monday morning, everyone.
Happy Monday. Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. It's summertime, which means many people at work are looking forward to taking some days off for vacation. Cybersecurity company Kaspersky has found cyber criminals are using the sentiment for their latest scams. Scammers are sending out emails about the topic of vacation as if they're from the HR team. The emails ask employees to confirm dates or reschedule their days off by clicking a phishing link. Over the weekend, Russian warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin led the Wagner troops in what he called a march for justice from eastern Ukraine to Moscow. For months, Prigozhin ranted against military chiefs for failing to supply his men with sufficient kit and ammunition. After what seemed to be a short-lived revolt, the Wagner troops and Kremlin came to an agreement late Saturday night. Charges against Prigozhin for armed mutiny were dropped and Prigozhin left for Belarus. Recently here in Korea, some netizens were enraged to find out that prisoners seemingly enjoyed a luxurious meal behind bars. Pictures of a dinner table from a detention center in Busan went viral, mainly because the Busan roundhouse kick assailant and the person who killed someone she met through a tutor match app are in prisons there. The menus include seaweed soup with beef or pork cutlets, which is why some are calling it a royal diet. But is it? In Korea, there's a popular go-to menu people think of. It's bean mixed rice. Back in the 1930s, when white rice was precious, inmates were given beans mixed with millet. That's why some people are calling prison food these days royal diets, sarcastically comparing their meals to that of inmates. But in reality, the food given to each inmate costs a little over $1 per meal, and that's similar to what we would pay for 컵라면. One prison official explained that even though beef is used in broth, they only use cheap parts and allocate small portions. Now, with all this information in hand, Cheska, what do you think about prison food here in Korea?
I absolutely agree with the sentiment. I think people are emotionally outraged because they don't think the inmates deserve the kind of treatment they're getting given what they've done. But I think we must pay attention to the fact that what the meal that they're getting has no direct correlation to the recurrence or how they rehabilitate. I mean, just to give you an example, Norway, Yeon, which you told me, they spend about 3 times more than South Korea do, yet the recurrence rate is very, very low.
Right.
So what I would like to highlight is the fact that personally, I would like to see my tax money go more into these rehabilitation programs, counselors and experts, and especially for juvenile crimes, because they really need our support to be back in the country. And Norway is one of the countries that does that really well.
Right, so Cheska's tilted a bit more to making sure we reform criminals. It's
Absolutely.
giving them one more chance to come back to society. And I hear that the Justice Ministry is considering raising the cap for inmates' meals. Right, Cheong, so could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I mean, the Justice Ministry said they would try to break the deal with the Finance Ministry on raising the budget allocated for inmates' meals. But it's worth noting how far we've already come in improving prisoners' living conditions. So based on concerns over human rights and inmates' health conditions, prisons nationwide make sure that meals given each day stay around 2,500 kilocalories per inmate. As you've mentioned, we've used to mix bean rice, which might be even a better nutritional value. But I personally think that the current meal plans are an adequate treatment for prisoners. To overly treat criminals with better meals when there are still people suffering from poor housing and starvation in the country, it will cause upset in the Korean general public.
For sure, already the general public is quite enraged.
A little bit outraged as well.
The inmates are having better food than they are, seemingly. And that was our news feed for this Monday. Let's now head into our discussion topic of the day. Yesterday was June 25th, a day when the Korean War broke out here in the peninsula. Hundreds of thousands of young men and women sacrificed their youth and some even their lives from this point onwards. Now take a look at the screen to find out more. 73 years ago, North Korea invaded the South. This sparked the Korean War that lasted 3 years and left the peninsula torn and tense for decades. The two Koreas haven't officially declared the end of war, and the North is continuing to build its nuclear capacity despite the international community's strong opposition. Ironically, though, as time has passed, our generation seems to be more nonchalant towards Pyongyang's threats. especially compared to our parents' or grandparents' generation that either experienced the war or heard about it from those who did. Today, NewsGen aims to answer 3 questions. 1. What do millennials and Gen Z in Korea think about the Korean War and the current situation on the Korean peninsula? 2. June is a month dedicated to commemorating the veterans and fallen soldiers of war. How attentive are young Koreans towards this subject? 3. Why should our generation care about veterans and soldiers who are currently in active combat? With it being a day after the anniversary of the start of the Korean War 73 years ago, and also June, a month to commemorate veterans and fallen soldiers, we're going to be talking about how our generation views those who risk their lives out on the battlefield. Now, I'd like to ask the first question to Cheska. Cheska, as I mentioned before, June is a month dedicated to paying respects to veterans, right? Tell us a bit more.
Yes. So in South Korea, June is a month for veterans. We have June 25th, just yesterday, which was the Memorial Day, to commemorate the fallen heroes, the veterans who have provided the security and the peace that we so enjoy today. And also, it's an anniversary of the Yeonpyeong Island incident. So the government organizes a lot of events to commemorate the families, the National Merit Award recipients, and the families and the people to sort of celebrate, but also to remember and never to forget what happened, because our generation actually technically didn't live through the war.
Right.
So it is very easy for us to sort of enjoy the day as a national holiday and forget what we've been through to be where we are today.
And yesterday was the 73rd anniversary of the Korean War. Xiang, tell us a bit more about how the war came to be and also how many young people then gave up everything to fight for our country.
Yeah, but just before we go in, technically it's not a national holiday, just to make sure it's the day Korean War began. And just to give you a bit more insight, before Korea's independence from Japan in 1945, the peninsula remained geographically and politically united in resistance against the Japanese rule. Then the Korean trusteeship was agreed at the Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers in December 1945, which divided Korea at the 38th parallel into 2 occupational zones, US in the south and the Soviet Union in the north. This was an agreement to only last for 5 years until the Korean peninsula fully recovered its capability to self-rule. However, in the following years of heightened Cold War, the 2 Koreas ruled by 2 clashing ideologies suffered mutual hostilities until the Korean War began with North Korea's invasion of South on the 25th of June 1950. The war lasted for 3 years until 1953, which ended in a stalemate alongside the complete destruction of both economies as well as trust between the 2 Koreas. Up to this day, South and North Korea remain separated and technically at war under the Korean Armistice Agreement. And your second question. According to the National Archives of Korea, a total of around 138,000 Korean soldiers and around 510,000 North Koreans soldiers lost their lives during the war. We estimate that around 3,500 soldiers were youth volunteers aged 17 or younger.
Wow.
Out of the ones who went through the military training and received a rank, 2,464 young soldiers lost their lives in the Korean War.
So a lot of youth lost their lives during the Korean War, and we haven't seen any full-scale war on the peninsula since 1953. And do you think that affects the way people from our generation, including yourself, view war?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the 2 Koreas did see active combat all throughout history. For example, 1968, the Blue House raid. We had the 1996 Gangneung infiltration incident. And as you mentioned earlier, Yeonpyeong-ejeon 2010 torpedo attack on Korea's Navy vessel RKS Cheonan, as well as the bombing of South Korea's Yeonpyeong Island, which almost escalated into a full-scale war. However, so the threat of war is still quite real in South Korea. But because it has already been 70 years since the Korean War ended, many are seemingly starting to forget about the war. Based on a 중앙일보 focus group interview, it turns out that the percentage of people who know exactly when the Korean War began is surprisingly low. Let's have a look at the screen. All in all, only 64% could answer correctly when the Korean War began, and this figure was especially low among the younger generation. Of the participants aged 19 to 29, only 45.6% could answer correctly, as well as half, or 50% of the people aged between 30 to 39 got it right. As the age group got older, the figure increased towards a more positive trend at 79.6% for ages between 50 and 59.
I mean, we can't blame them because they didn't really see for themselves their family going out to the battlefield and so on and so forth. So while many cannot really remember what happened during the Korean War, I do think that we've seen a lot of war happen outside of Korea. For instance, many young Korean soldiers have been out in the field for Afghanistan or Iraq, and we're also seeing other young soldiers risking their lives over in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And based on that, I do think more and more young people are realizing the significance of lives and the severity
as well.
Exactly, severity of war. What do you think about that, Cheska?
Actually, this is such a great conversation because I must also admit, I live in this beautiful oblivion that war doesn't happen where I live and it will probably never happen. But as Xiang mentioned, when he mentioned the age group of people that participated in the war back in the Korean War, under 17, I can't imagine people younger than my brother going into the war and never knowing when they'll be back. So I think even though...
Those were volunteers as well. They volunteered to risk their lives.
Exactly,
Right.
and they've never received proper military training, so they're literally going to sort of body block the entire country. So I think it really rings deep when I hear these testimonials. And even though our generation did not technically go through the war, I think we vicariously become more involved because of thanks to the widespread internet and the information that becomes available to us. Just to give you an example, I think a lot of the protests and demonstrations against the war that happened for Ukraine and Iraq were young people in the 20s and 30s because of the access to the footages and the information that we get, and because we realize that war should never, ever happen.
War should never, ever happen, and God forbid that it does. But let's think about a scenario where war would break out again here in the peninsula, like active, full-fledged combat. What would you do? Could you imagine yourself out on the battlefield right now?
I mean, to be honest, I'm willing to take part in the war. I've finished my military training as well, 2 years in the army, in the Korean military. So I'm willing to take part in active combat, intelligence, reconnaissance, even coordinating the international allies and forces so we can have a better chance at war. I think it makes a bit of difference for the Korean males who've actually had to spend 2 years of the best years of their lives in your early 20s, mid-20s. And I think that really changes your perspective on thinking that you are ready to fight for the country at any given time when it has to be done. So, according to a recent survey commissioned by Arirang on whether women should also be obliged to complete Korea's mandatory military service, a really high percentage of 56.5% agreed. So out of the sample size of 1,006 males and females in Generation Z, so quite the younger people, it was interesting to see that over 50% of just female participants also agreed for females to commit to military service. I think this shows a great future commitment for Korea's civil line of defense as well. I just would you guys go to the military if you
what
had
about
to?
you?
Yeah,
Would you
we were discussing this before the show, and I said yes, I would do anything they tell me to do. But I never received military training myself, so I don't know how to use a gun.
You're willing to fight
But
for
I
the
am
country,
willing,
for the nation.
And I think that's what our generation is composed of. We are willing to fight for our country because we believe not only in equality, but I guess justice as well. What about you, Cheska? If war broke out and your brother had to go out on the battlefield, or yourself, what would you think?
Also, when Xiang just reminded me, I also want to take this moment to not only thank the veterans, but the active soldiers who are in the line of defense at the moment and who have received training. Because as a woman, I think I'm always grateful, and I owe it very much to the male who spend the best part of their lives going into the military. Now, I think we all remember when we received that false alarm, fortunately, about the North Korean attack.
Yeah.
But if it were to break out, which I hope it doesn't, I think I would only participate in protection and prevention, but I would never be actively involved in procurement.
I see. And
Combat, you mean, like battle.
in active combat.
In active combat, yes.
And we asked the same question to our viewers, and here's what they had to say on today's discussion topic. Take a look at the screen. Jack Thompson said, one of my friends knows a guy who recently joined the U.S. Marines. He does worry, but he knows he's serving his country, and that has always been a passion of his life, and he's always been determined to do it. Doina Arhire said, no one in my family's in the army, yet I think that one should fight for his country if needed. Leon Teo said Singapore has mandatory military service for able-bodied males at the age of 18, and they have to serve for 2 years. Lots of my uncles and male cousins have served in the military, and I think it's necessary as it's for an honorable cause. And we're now going to take time to actually remember the sacrifices those out at war have made. By doing so, we're going to include a retired colonel in our talks. We'll be interviewing him right after this. We're now going to hear from a retired colonel who has served in the Korean military for 35 years. He's now a special affairs professor at Kookmin University. His main expertise is related to national security. It's Professor Park Hee-rak. Great to have you here, Professor Park.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Professor, I'd like to ask you the first question. Today, we're commemorating Patriots and Veterans Month, which falls on June. Now, I know there have been many events held nationwide to pay respects to the fallen soldiers or veterans who served for our country, but not many of those paying respects are from our generation. Why do you think this is the case, and what do you think about this, especially as a person who served in the military for 35 years?
Yeah, it is true. Most people worry about the lack of security awareness among South Korean young people. But I think it is a natural phenomenon because young people did not experience war. South Korean people born in the late 1990s or 2000s, that is, those in their 20s and 30s today, did not have the opportunity to experience neither military-related education and training nor war. The recent civilian president did not emphasize much on war preparation or national security. This is the reason why I described as a natural phenomenon. Recently, however, North Korea sank the Cheonan warship and bombarded Yeonpyeong Island in 2010. It also conducted numerous nuclear tests and fired missiles from time to time. Therefore, I think that the current 2030 generation has also come to know the importance of security to some extent. The problem is that they have to go to work every day to earn money and to develop their careers. In this sense, I do not think that they do not know the importance of sacrifice for the country. I think the current 2030 generation simply does not have time to participate in the commemorative events for the sacrifices made for the country. In addition, the real problem is that a significant number of South Korean adults, especially progressive South Koreans, tend not to take North Korea's nuclear threat seriously. It is regrettable that perceptions of a North Korean nuclear threat vary depending on ideology. I think middle-aged people who are biased toward ideology and neglect security have more problems than young people.
Yes, Professor. I mean, we do take it for granted, I think, the younger generation of the threat of war. Of course, we don't know the exact pain and suffering Korea had to go through, and there is still imminent threat. We're still technically at war with North Korea. Could you tell us the war you remember and what we should take away from your personal experience?
Yes, I was born in 1955, 2 years after the armistice of the Korean War. However, our hometown was part of the Nakdong defense line. When I was young, my friends and I found lots of traces of trenches in the nearby mountains. There were artillery shell fragments too. I heard a lot about the Korean War from my parents and other adults in the village. However, it was only after entering the Korean Military Academy that I learned about the war properly. I studied the history of the Korean War in class very sincerely. I got a high score in the subject. I learned in detail how the North Korean armed forces planned the war and why South Korean forces were not properly prepared and had to retreat. Through this process, I realized that the old saying is true. If you wish peace, prepare for war. What I want to say to young people is clear. We need to prepare for war if we wish peace. Because Russia found Ukraine was not fully prepared for war. It attacked Ukraine last year. The current government is actively preparing against North Korea's nuclear threat while strengthening the South Korea-US alliance. The recent decrease in provocations by North Korea is because South Korea is trying to be fully prepared. In this regard, I would like to emphasize once again that if you wish peace, prepare for war.
Professor, based on your experience as a young soldier and spending your time in the military, could you tell us what was one of the most frightening parts of being in the war and serving your country was?
I served as a platoon leader and company commander in the field in the late 1970s and early 1980s. At that time, I had to run 10 kilometers within 60 minutes with an 11-kilogram backpack. Wow. I had to hit the target with at least 18 shots out of 20 with my rifle. There were also frequent 100-kilometer marches. I slept during the day and trained for night combat. However, as time goes on, I heard that the intensity of training weakened. I would like to ask junior military officers and soldiers to increase the intensity of training. There's a saying I heard often during my military days. My superiors in the military always emphasized that every drop of sweat shed in training saves a drop of blood in war. I heard that the US soldiers said that real combat is easier than training because they train very intensively. In this respect, our military needs to increase the intensity of peacetime training. The young military officers should actively study and discuss on how to win the combat if a war occurs. They must always carry field manuals on platoon leader combat or company combat and read them continuously to become familiar with them. I would like to emphasize once again that if we want peace, we must prepare for war.
If we want peace, we must prepare for war. Thank you so much, Professor Park. And we would like to say on behalf of our generation, thank you to all the soldiers that risked their lives for Korea to be safe, well, relatively safe as we are today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your service, Professor.
All right, and Professor Park made me realize that South Koreans do typically shrug off North Korean missile threats. As he mentioned, I don't think we're as alert or on edge about the threats we've been seeing so far. But he also made me realize just how grateful we should be for many soldiers who sacrificed their lives for the life I'm living out now.
Absolutely.
And I hope all wars do come to an end. My heart goes out to all the soldiers out at the battlefield. Anything you would like to add on?
To be honest, I found Professor Park's comments really refreshing.
Yeah.
I didn't expect some of the answers he'd be giving, and I wholeheartedly agree that we should make the military training a bit more intense. I mean, we are technically, well, we are probably the only country in the world which is technically having a neighbor as offensive as North Korea. Israelis have their entire population having military training, and the intensity, even I experienced, was a bit of a lacking experience. I wanted to go full on, have the most exercise, the most training that I could possibly imagine. But the current trends, I think, of human rights abuse and people thinking, if you take out too much sweat out of this guy, then he's going to complain and things like that, does hinder security of the country. So, I mean, he did mention preparing for war is the best way to avoid the war. I'm all for peace and prosperity as well. I don't like even the division of nations, which is the baseline of any combat, any conflict. We need more land, we need more resources, clash of interests and things like that. But it's unavoidable as human beings.
For sure.
Right. I mean, Cheska mentioned great points about loving all the peace and trying to avoid battle as much as possible. But as you've seen, there's an aggressor and there's the
reality that
we
should prepare for sure. And in light of that, we would also like to thank all the soldiers out there, all the veterans out there. Once more, thank you so much for your service. And that's all we have for you on NewsGen today. We'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Kim Si-young.
Thank you very much.
And Cheska Dain-han.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
News Generation.